Sure.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Information Playground. This is a program where listeners and viewers get to catch up on what's going on in technology, and hopefully we keep you a little safer by educating you in that. My name is Ron Bush, and I own Ron Bush Consulting. We underwrite the Information Playground. You could be listening to us or watching us in several different ways. We are first off, broadcast Monday mornings at 9 and Friday afternoons at 1 p.m. on WVLP. If you're in Valparaiso, Indiana, and some other parts of Northwest Indiana, you can catch WVLP at 103.1 FM or stream it, WVLP.org. It's an excellent radio station, and if you haven't visited their website, I hope you do. They do a lot in the community, and you can become involved in the community as well by working with WVLP. We also have podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and 5 or 6 others. We also have a YouTube channel and the podcast channel as well. All are called the Information Playground. So with that, thank you for being with us today, and welcome. And my special guest is Matthew Cloud. Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Ron. How are you today?
I'm great. And you?
Doing very well. Thank you.
Good. Would you tell the folks a little bit about yourself, just so if they're not regular listeners, they'll get an introduction to you?
Sure. I'm the department chair for the School of IT at Ivy Tech's Lake County campus, and vice chair for our statewide program in computer science, and an advisor to the governor on the Cybersecurity Council. And to Cisco for their academic program. So they have a Cisco NetAcad or Network Academy, and I'm a global advisor to them, more on Python and some of the cybersecurity stuff.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. So there's a lot going on, a lot to talk about. We'll get to COVID-19, but I don't want to start there. That's where everybody else is at right now. Let's talk a little bit about edge computing. We touched on it last time. Edge computing versus private public clouds. Let's tell the folks first off what that is, and well, you take it from there.
Sure, no problem. When we think about the cloud, most people just think about it being cloud because it's out there and you don't have to worry about how it works. It's just there and working for you in the most ideal setup. When we think about a one that's wholly managed by someone else, a private cloud is something that you're managing for your workspace. So it might be your IT group is having its own private cloud like we do on the academic side. There's a group of us that run our own private cloud. We call it NetLab. That's from NDG. NDG is NetDev Group. They have a NetLab device that's used by many different colleges to provide a private cloud instance that we manage and put virtual machines. So if we have a common use for cloud spaces are that you have file storage. That's what most people use it for. You have a file, you don't have to worry about it being stored locally. You can have it on the cloud like OneDrive or Google Drive, and it's stored out there, and you can synchronize locally, or you could just have it on the cloud. Lots of ways to do that. Most people are pretty familiar with that setup. But you can do much more with a cloud setup. You can, instead of having a local operating system of Windows, you could also have Linux, you could have Mac OS, lots of different server systems that you could run, Red Hat. You could run those locally, but you run out of space. So it's much more effective typically to use that out on the cloud. And you only use what you need. And that's where Amazon comes into play a lot these days with Amazon Web Services. So you have this public cloud instance out there that you're working with. You may be able to subdivide that out to being a private instance for you. And it could be a private instance on the cloud or a private instance locally, or some sort of combination in between. And at some point, it may make more sense to have some sort of something in between, something on the edge. So you don't want to have it out there on the cloud completely and utilizing those sources, and it's becoming too costly for you possibly. But you also don't have the staffing to handle that locally. So edge computing allows you to have ownership of that private cloud instance somewhere out there. You don't really care where it's at still, but you want it to be as low cost real estate as you can. That's what Mayor Pete Buttigieg worked with Amazon to do the Amazon Edge computing services in the old Studebaker factories in South Bend.
Oh, really?
So
I wasn't aware of that.
Real estate is not being utilized. Yeah, so we've got these old buildings, old spaces been sitting vacant since the 60s. And it's been able to help revitalize the local economy because you need somebody managing that. Now, it doesn't take a lot of people to manage a data center these days, but you need people who can work with it. Think of it as an apartment complex, and you have tenants on this cloud system, people who can manage those services for them. And if you're available locally, that's great. Like, well, we use this NDG NetLab, and for us, a little bit of the difficulty is we do it at IUPUI, Purdue, and IU also have a stored data center there. But if I need to make a change to it physically, I got to drive down there to go do that, which is not necessarily, all that great. If I need to go swap out a hard drive, maybe once every year, still I'm having to go make a 6-hour round trip drive when it's all said and done, just to go change out a hard drive. So it's better. We've been able to get some faculty who can help locally with that kind of situation to make that easier for everybody as more faculty become involved and understand how that works. And so there are groups like Metro Edge who have decided to come out with some ideas about putting these data centers in a container. And we've trained faculty and students for the past 5 years how to build virtualized data centers in 100 square foot spaces, up to 200, as much space as we need, but typically they're about 100 square feet, which fits actually quite well in a container. And so we've been talking with Metro Edge about, as well as Kennedy King College out of Chicago, the City Colleges of Chicago, how we might be able to, one, train people to do that, to build in containers, and be able to support that in low-cost real estate areas. If you're looking at Gary or the south side of Chicago, those are pretty low-cost, relatively speaking, for real estate, but also still have really good access to the internet. So the backbone of the internet is going right through there. So potentially that makes low-cost real estate to do these high computing needs.
Now you mentioned,
go ahead.
Forgive the interruption, but you mentioned containers several times. Mm-hmm. For those of our audience that's not in IT, not in the industry, tell them a little bit what containers is, because that's a really popular subject or topic right now.
Sure, and I'm using containers more in the physical terminology right now, because they're containerizing when you think about containers from the IT perspective, which I'll talk a little bit more. But what I was really referring to is like a container you see on the back of a flatbed truck, right? Putting a data center, the physical data center inside of one of those with AC, putting it into a neighborhood to provide free Wi-Fi for those neighborhoods that don't have internet access locally. And when you look at the census tracts, so some of the things that came out of COVID is we're getting better access to data. A lot of our models, when you talk about COVID-19 modeling, were based upon bad data, but we're getting better data. And we can see that in Lake County, 86% of the homes have internet access at them. That doesn't sound too bad. It's still not great for the 14% that don't. But when you look deeper into the details, you might think that the rural areas are those that don't have it. Actually, the rural areas, 98% of the homes have internet access. It's the urban areas around the campus where it's 40 to 60% of the homes that don't have internet. That's a tremendous divide. And it's right there where they have it available to them by many different partners, whether it's AT&T or Xfinity, or, they don't need satellite there because they've got direct fiber access available, but they don't have the funding. So there's some things that are happening through Congress and other areas to try to help make that work better. But one of the things, aside from that, the Federal Reserve Bank has funding that can help with communities. That's another resource that we've been looking at, how we can utilize those funding packages to help the local neighborhoods. That's what's supposed to be happening since the 1960s, actually. But those processes have been far too difficult for people to work through. You've probably seen that in the news, even with the payments to small businesses, right? The loans that are available out there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes larger corporations were in a better situation to be able to get the funds that were intended for smaller businesses to keep them afloat. And thankfully, we're seeing some of those, like, what is it, the Shake Shack, give the money back.
That's the only one I've heard of, but hopefully there are more that.
Yeah, I'm not going to call out businesses on here that maybe took advantage of that. They couldn't, but that's one that said, "Hey, we're going to hey, maybe we really don't need this."
Yeah.
I don't blame them for taking advantage of what funding is available, because they have employees that need that help too. Right. I get that. So,
I think the small business latest figure I've heard is that small businesses in America employ 67 or 68% of Americans, so of employees that are hired, that have jobs. So
I wouldn't doubt that.
I appreciate the Fortune 500 and the Fortune 200 and the Fortune 50. I appreciate all that, but it's the little guy that really carries the weight on his back.
That's what drives keeping a town afloat, having a downtown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now that we've talked about Edge, you mentioned something else that kind of leads us into it. You mentioned AWS, Amazon Web Services. Tell us a little bit about that.
So there's another version of containers. And so let's say you have Red Hat and you have Windows Server and you have, there's different flavors of Red Hat Enterprise that you could run, or different versions of Linux. And maybe you really don't need the full operating system. Maybe you don't need to run everything under the sun, but you only need to run a part of that. So you can do that in containers and only run the parts of those systems that you need. So that utilizes less resources, less costly. So that's actually a fairly simple context. You can think of Kubernetes as one of those things that does that as well to help manage that process. Red Hat OpenShift is one of the things that they're working on to help make that easier for people. And then you can even go down to, like, I focus more on the programming side. So I teach my students about Lambda functions, going down even farther, virtualization. So Lambda functions are, I only need to run a particular function. Maybe I just need to test and see, has a certain operation run on a steel plant or whatever it might be. But I only need it to run like once a day. I don't need a full operating system to do that. I just need this function to run. So it goes out there, checks it, and it's done.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So it's really virtualizing and making things only to utilize the resources you need when you need them.
Mm-hmm. So something that we talked about prior to starting is Cyber Range. What is that all about?
So we have a Cyber Range, and I can show that on there for your YouTube videos if you'd like.
Please do. Right. And remember that you'll have to describe it for listeners and podcasters.
Yes. So do you see my screen here for the Cyber Range?
I do.
Great. I'm going to move this video out of the way. So, all right. So we've been looking at a lot of different options out there, and I have a few interns this semester, as well as the Valparaiso campus. They've been putting in a cyber range, a physical cyber range. The idea here is we've done really well at training students on how to create a network that's secure and how to look after the fact with forensics, digital forensics, and even looking at hacking, how we can look at things after it's set up. But what we want to do is, how can we set up people to be able to actively defend, right? So there's somebody trying to get into your network right now. How do we stop that, right? Plus, it gets more exciting even when you look at competitions and those kind of things. So one of the things that we found out there is this AWS Cyber Range. And let me see, you can go out here on GitHub. And if you were to just Google Cyber Range, it's called SecDevOps-CUSE. And so that's out of Syracuse. A graduate student there has been working on this. And there's a lot in here that can be difficult for people to really follow and read on the do the README. So we've had several students working on how we can make something like this work on an AWS format. Just to kind of describe how that works, when we think about a cyber range to train someone, we want to have targets. So we have a system, it might be like a bank or whatever you might want to be looking at, but it may have many different operating systems from Windows 7 through Windows 10, server systems, Linux-based systems, etc. All those different virtual machines that you might want to have for your target. And you may have specific sets of software sitting on that as well. And so we can use that within virtual machines or containers on Amazon to make that work. And then you have attackers. They need to have their own virtual machines to work with, right? Because we don't want this out there on an open network for someone to actually do this with. You might end up with unintended consequences, right? So we want to make sure it's all sandboxed in there. We do that through NetLab currently, but NetLab is difficult to update, right? Because unless you're sitting there physically at the system, it's difficult to create the VMs that you need there, at least at the present time. So we have these attackers that are set up with their own OS and their own software, right? Typically Kali is used. A Linux-based system. They're using Python to modify how they might attack. Go ahead, Ron.
Forgive me, but again, for listeners that aren't seeing this and also may not be familiar, when you're throwing out a term like Kali, you might just define, just so everybody can go with us here.
Well, sure. Kali is a version of Linux that has a set of tools for people working in cybersecurity that could be used for defense or using for attacking, right? And so Kali, K-A-L-I, is a package all set up in Linux to make that work for you.
One small addition that I'll make is Kali is a valued tool, as you mentioned, for cybersecurity. It's also a valuable tool for hackers, and that's true down the line. I can't think of an exception that cybersecurity people, a tool that cybersecurity people don't use that hackers don't also use. It's the same tool for the same reason. A cybersecurity guy is going to be trying to find the vulnerabilities and mitigate those vulnerabilities. Hacker is going to be trying to find those vulnerabilities and use them.
Well, even like Zoom, like we're using right now.
Yeah.
Right? There's been a whole new set of tools added to Zoom this last week.
Yes.
So there's a shield down there, so you can lock a room, keep people out. You can add a waiting room instead of having to do that in advance, adding passwords so people don't come in and bomb your Zoom session.
Yeah. Yeah, I got surprised the first day after applying the updates. Of course, I had a Zoom meeting and had to find certain things that weren't there where they had been before. So
right. Yeah, it keeps getting moved around, but it's moving, getting better progress.
Indeed.
And so that's a similar thing that's happened with those. What we're trying to replicate within a cyber range, a sandboxed range. So you have a red team, your attackers, your blue team, your defenders. So people might have heard about red team, blue team. Heck, I was wearing an EC Council. EC Council is one of our partners that does certified ethical hacking and certified hacking forensics investigation. We use that coursework within our courses towards those certifications. And I was wearing one of their shirts on a visit to, we went to Niagara Falls over on the Canadian side. Yeah. We came back and I stopped at an Arby's, and the guy, the cashier, he saw my shirt. He's like, "Hey, are you on the red team or the blue team?" I was like, "Well, I'm the guy who helps fund those kind of events." So, but it was interesting to see people that recognized that shirt just randomly out there.
So define who the attackers are. Again, for the listeners not familiar with red team and blue team, the blue team is usually the defenders, and the red team, maybe always the defenders. And the red teams are the ones trying to get through the defenses.
To break in. So, and you might often have a scenario where people are often just being the attacker, right? Because you can hack into systems that are there. You can define it. We can set it off, put it over to the side and say, you're going to try to keep hacking away at that. But that doesn't mean somebody's trying to keep them out, right? And so what the cyber range does is allow us to have truly a blue team that could work in an environment that we could keep changing if we wish, right? Because life just keeps changing, right? And so you have this blue team sitting there, and they have their own virtual machines that they need to have set up and their own tool sets to be able to defend against what might be a set of scenarios. So there might be a different set. It's kind of hard to see on this image. I wish there was a better image to look at, but there might be ransomware or other attack code that's sitting here within this cyber range that the attackers might choose to employ, right? And you could even make it a bigger scenario where you have people here working at these workstations, and even look at the social attack side of this, because all they need is a web browser to log into this through Amazon, right? And all this is going to be inside of our own cyber range secured session, right? Not on the general Amazon network. And so you have to have all that through a VPN, a virtual private network, to keep that secure. Otherwise, you may not have things going on as you wish. I guess the best way to say that. And you can have a virtual network connection to what you're looking at. People could do this without a virtual private network, but that might lend itself to whatever you've got going on in here inside of your malware that you're working with, where they can, where that might escape in a way that you don't want, much like what may have happened with what's happening with COVID-19.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's an excellent point. Just a couple of things before we take a break, and then I want to switch over to COVID-19. Gosh, that's a great segue. But we can come back to this as well. After all that buildup, I forgot what I was going to say. So let me just say that you're listening to WVLP. It's 103.1 FM if you're in Northwest Indiana. And we are on that station on Monday mornings at 9 o'clock, Friday afternoons at 1 p.m. And that, of course, that's Central Time. If you are listening to us on demand, you're probably listening to us on one of the podcast stations. We're on Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and we also have a YouTube channel, all with the name The Information Playground. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to pause just one moment. And welcome you back. You're listening to Ron Bush with Ron Bush Consulting. We are underwriting the program, and our special guest, Matthew Cloud, a good friend. And Matthew, if folks have any interest or want to follow up with you for questions, maybe they're interested in things that are going on to Ivy Tech, and there's always a lot going on at Ivy Tech, how can they get in touch with you?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen while I do this. So since it's going to be on YouTube anyways, right?
Right.
So one of the easiest ways is to go to ivytech.edu/IT. And from there, you can see about the variety of our different programs that we have. If you choose any of them, like if you're interested in cybersecurity.
You only have Cyber Range up. You're not on your...
Not on the other one. Okay. So let's see. It's been a little tricky with Zoom lately.
Yes.
We'll try it with just the screen, maybe. Screen share one. How's that?
So you started it, and have you plugged in the appropriate screen? Because
I have.
Oh. Well, you're not being successful with this one. The other one.
Well, all right. Yeah, it's not been working very well with Zoom with sharing the screen lately, unless I'd go to a specific screen, but at least we got it earlier.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess what I'll say then is if you go to ivytech.edu/IT, you can follow through and see our programs. Within the programs, if you were to choose cybersecurity at the bottom, it has locations. You can find our location information there for Lake County or any of our campuses in Indiana where you might have interest. But you can reach me directly at mcloud3, MCLOUD3 at ivytech.edu, or call our main number, 219-981-1111, extension 5369.
Great.
And that will get you to my phone, which will ring through forward over to my house currently. So you should still be able to reach me. If not, it'll still get a voicemail. So it's kind of been a wild time on all that.
Great. So, and I should mention, Ron Bush, if you have questions on the program or thoughts, Ron at ronbushconsulting.com is the way to catch me. And of course, the website, ronbushconsulting.com. So with that, you mentioned it's not unlike COVID-19 when we were talking about containment. And that's what I wanted to. Again, for folks that are not used to it, and I increasingly find people that VPNs are a new idea to them, virtual private networks. The reason that you as an individual or as a company, especially with your workers, your employees working remotely, need to have VPNs for every employee is simply because A, it keeps you safer, and B, it keeps you more anonymous. And it does that. If you can imagine a tunnel through the internet that's encrypted, that's probably mixing metaphors, but a tunnel through the internet, it's not that it's impossible to hack, it's that it's unlikely to even be seen and to be hacked. And so, and it is encrypted, so data stays right in the tunnel.
I like to think of it like this big, beautiful wall we have being built across the South. The virtual private network is that tunnel going right underneath it.
Probably not getting a laugh in Southern Arizona or Southern California, or maybe Texas for that matter. But I agree, that's a great analogy.
Maybe.
So let's.
Well, it is how it works.
I'm sorry?
I said that is how it works, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
So COVID-19, the joke there obviously was that it was supposedly, the virus itself was supposedly being studied in Wuhan, escaped. The story I heard is from an intern who infected her boyfriend, and the next place it shows up is that wet market. So let's talk about all the changes that COVID-19 has brought to Americans. This is primarily an American program. I'm told that there are people in other countries that are streaming it from WVLP. I don't know any of them. So let's look at this. Might even look at the world. We can start with the planet and work down.
Sure.
So,
well, I have people who work for me who are from Wuhan. So
okay.
It's not that unusual for me to talk about these things. And my background's in biomedical engineering.
Indeed.
My undergrad is in radiological health engineering, which is a subset of nuclear engineering. So like with most things, it's about how you use from China all the time. I think they're great, but there can be issues with the Chinese government. There can be issues with their own government, right? So it's trying to work with people. And I found working with both, I've never worked with the Chinese government, so I don't know much about that side of it. Right. But working with our own government, I have worked with many different levels of it, and find that most people are trying to do the right thing there. I'm not going to go into the politics of it with Wuhan, but I do know that NIH was funding research that we were looking to try to predict where something like this might happen. It wasn't just there. It was all over Asia and all over the world that NIH is looking at that. So it happens to be, it came from there. And it's unfortunate we did not get the information out of there like we should have. Yeah. Whatever the reasoning may be.
Right.
Because it's made it difficult for any of us to really predict what might be happening. And that's one of the things that I do. So for me personally, I actually train people on Python. I train instructors. I help set up an instructor training for 28 different areas of IT across our state. We also train people in other countries, well, a little bit in other countries, but mainly throughout the U.S. But I train people more on Python, and this summer I actually have a course that was already planned called Pythonator 3, Rise of the Machine Languages in AI, based out of Los Angeles this summer. It'll be virtual. It's free for instructors, supported by the Western Academic Support and Training Center that's partially funded by Cisco, and the community colleges out of Chicago. They've been a great partner where we work with Python to help change how networking is done, because that's where Cisco's interest lies, is how do we use that type of technology so that we automatically limit intrusion using machine learning techniques. So if we see something on the network that's coming out that is odd, so each of your devices that you use typically has a pattern that it does. It's looking at the network, looking to see that it has a good connection, that we're maintaining that dynamic IP connection. So most people don't have to put in an IP address when you connect to a network anymore. Say, I want this Wi-Fi network. You might need a username and password. But aside from that, everything else is handled for you in most cases. Well, as people have done that, we want to limit what's happening there, but still permit people to access it without having to go through a million layers of red tape. And that's what we even see with what's happening here with COVID-19 on how do we decide who has access to what. It's best decided at the local level as much as possible. We have guidance from a national level, and we see things at a local level. So how do you make that merge? We have meetings with FEMA and all these other different groups to try to decide how do we make that work without turning it into a dictatorship, right? Everybody must do this, right, because that doesn't work either, right?
Can you hold just one moment, please?
It's you know, everybody wishes there was just some simple magic answer, right? Go ahead. So what I was saying is that COVID-19 and how we're trying to manage that even on a local network are similar. So one of the things that I have been teaching for the past couple of years in my Python classes for instructors is how to use Oracle Big Data systems to scrape data from Health and Human Services to track where the viral trends might go, right? And so there's lots of different models people have been looking at over the past, several weeks, right? All of those models, for them to be good, you have to have good data,
right,
to make that work. And I think that issue has been brought to light to people, that we have a lot of issues with getting good information.
Yeah.
A lot of times we hear it's about testing, and testing is part of it, because you don't know who has it and who doesn't. How do you know if you have good data?
Right.
And are the tests valid or not?
Yeah, I've lost track of how many test kits and ventilators and all that other stuff. I don't know if we're up to the speed. I think they were promising a million test kits a day, but I don't recall when that is. But you're right. Again, on the news, I had to go out for a moment this morning, and I heard on the news that someone who had tested 2 weeks ago, when they had symptoms, they're just received a call or an email telling them to go in to get their results, and the lady was wondering, is it worth my time? I don't have the symptoms anymore. So it's that lag in information, that lag in data. None of us were prepared for this. So
not only that, but we don't even know really how it reacts. It seems to me that it's acting a lot more like poison ivy.
Yeah.
And
some
that
people it gets, and
you may not be positive now, but you may be positive later.
Yeah. It
may hit a threshold where your system cannot. And this is not a biomedical program, so I'm not going to go into those details. But other than the fact from the cybersecurity aspect, and this is why I float back and forth between those two areas of expertise, is that they relate to each other in the sense that you may have someone who came onto your network, and that ties me back to the machine learning and cybersecurity, who came into your network with a device that was fine. But now it's got malware that's attacked it, or the malware is set off, or there's enough malware that it's affecting your network, like maybe a bad connection that we're getting a few minutes ago. Maybe there's something on there, right? And so if you have machine learning to look at what, if we look at it from a classified standpoint or classification standpoint, right? Not as in security classified, but as in classification, we can say, well, we know that this is an okay thing that's happening right now. It's sending so many pings out, it's using so much bandwidth, and that's normal. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's like, oh gosh, I shut down the system at Texas A&M when I was a sophomore or junior because I did a who is query trying to look for friends that might want to help create a new game. Uh-huh. And it was inadvertent, it wasn't intended, but there weren't systems in place to look, this is abnormal activity. A student shouldn't be doing a global who is and seeing who's on every computer on the systems at the college at one time. You know, nobody thought that was a possibility. Yeah. So machine learning can look for those kind of abnormal activities and say, oh, we're going to isolate that node and not allow it access for now until we can validate that it's okay. And that's what we're doing right now with the COVID-19 type stuff. Yeah. If someone, we're kind of isolating ourselves now because we don't have good systems to know that. And as we develop systems that allow us to test and validate that people are healthy and okay, that access is coming forth with phase one as that's being known. But the same thing with networks. You don't just let anybody into your office, mm-hmm. typically, particularly if you have classified information.
Right, right.
And so that's what we're getting to. Go ahead.
I just can't let the moment go by. So I've recently done a webinar for Indiana CPA Society, and in there we were talking about working remotely, and so here's the problem that any small business has if they're able to stay working, they've got their employees working from home. Now, in most cases, unless the company has purchased a separate internet connection, and my guess is very few have, at least the ones that were forced to do it because of COVID-19. Now you've got people working on their home network. Are they logging into your server at the office? That home network has all the home devices. So Johnny and Susie's devices that have connected to McDonald's public Wi-Fi and been all over the place. Yours, everybody's public devices, laptops, desktops, tablets, phones, of course. All of that stuff may have things on it. Maybe it's an iPhone and the viruses that it has on it, or virus that it has on it, doesn't affect Apple products, but it does your Windows environment. Now you've passed that stuff right on to you. It's the same idea as the carrier that doesn't ever feel the symptoms, but they carry the disease. And now other people get sick as a result of it. Same idea. There we go.
Okay, so one of the major issues with VPNs, in fact, from InfraGard that we're getting information about attacks on VPNs through this type of scenario. If people are using their home network to connect with a VPN, who knows what they have on their home computer? And now that is having access to, through that tunnel, right? I was just talking about the big wall, and you go take a tunnel and go right past it. Well, now all that stuff goes right into your network. You've opened up a huge tunnel. Yeah. It's not really small in that case. It's big. So like if you work for city government or at Ivy Tech, faculty and staff are using we're using Ivy Tech computers, right? But we're trying to look at that situation now, like for our IT students. We're trying to set up a VPN connection for them where they could use their local computer, but then it's going to an isolated set of computers that we have on campus for testing the stuff. So those computers, if they use it, whatever they download to, it's not going to be a big deal because that is a subdivided network that doesn't have access to the rest of the network at Ivy Tech. And it's isolated, like I was talking about with the cyber range. And with the way we set those computers up, once they log out, everything they were working on that computer is gone. Now, what that does is it allows them to work with a system that has 16 gigs of RAM or something that they need to do virtual machines that they likely don't have at home. Mm-hmm. But it also limits our vulnerability. So they could do something that might affect that machine right there, but we've got extra software built into those systems to prevent them from installing stuff they can't. Well, one, we don't let them install anything on it, right? That's the only system they can log into, or other systems like that same setup. And they don't have free reign on the network to get into anything else.
So there's some valuable lessons, in fact, quite a slew of them that you've already mentioned, plus what I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So first off, an employer who is going to have his employees work remotely from home should, one, provide a separate internet connection with a policy in place that no one accesses that connection except for the employee and his work computer. He should have provided a computer, laptop, something, so that employee uses that once again, so that the connection remains pure, the connection to the company network. You've got a whole host of things that need to go on there. So you need to have thought ahead. You need to have your antivirus, have your Windows firewall turned on if that's what you're using. You need to have things in place. There are such things as virtual phone systems. I'm familiar with RingCentral and Avaya as a couple of names. You need to have what else?
Well, and you don't necessarily have to have a separate internet connection as long as you have that computer on a separate subnet.
How many home computer users are going to know how to set up a separate subnet?
Yeah, it's not that hard though.
It's not that
possible.
hard.
You can do that with very. I mean, it can be as simple as if they're going home with a computer, they can just have a separate router or a separate switch that they're going to connect with there. It depends upon what they're doing, right? If they need a virtual private network for what they're doing, it's probably worth it to provide them with that access device.
Yeah.
And they could use the same internet connection. But one of the things that I've done and that I've kind of gone back to is when I used to run my consulting business for software development, I had usually 3 different internet providers to my home for redundancy and also to increase my bandwidth. Right? But at least if one went down, the other one can pick it up. I've gotten into the habit now that I don't do that type of work anymore. I do all this stuff on an academic side, and I have, direct access at the campus to iLight. So I don't really need that there as long as I have a connection from home. But with the increased use from, my kids using Zoom to connect to their classes, and I got 2 kids in college, just trying to find a space physically where we can have these kind of discussions privately, but also so that they can have the bandwidth they need. I'm glad that Sprint provides us, we use Sprint for our network, the free hotspots, so I can use that when needed. So I do switch over to that as needed. I've even considered getting a couple internet access providers to give me additional access here. I'm right next to the Notre Dame campus. I've got good internet access here. I just concerned about having just one main provider anymore.
Right. Well, and depending on in your case, it's not absolutely necessary. But the business that I owned before, I had healthcare as one of the industries that I served. Hospitals, right. I had their records. Hospitals needed to be able to see that at any time. So I had to have a backup ISP as well as a redundancy built in every part of the system. Right. So that isn't always it isn't necessary for most folks, but for some of the people that we're probably reaching, it is.
Well, for government workers, for nursing, even in what we're doing here for Ivy Tech, all of our faculty, we've got 30,000 faculty or something like that in staff for Ivy Tech across the state, and we've got to keep our students' information secure. So again, we're using work computers, not home computers, even though it's on a home network.
Right.
So it allows us to subdivide it that way.
So it also comes to mind.
That can be a more simple situation.
We both spoke, and I didn't hear what you said. Go ahead.
Yes, your workspace is, you have to make sure that people can't see your secure information. That's why I'm kind of back here in a corner.
So
just trying to find I thought about, clearing out the stuff underneath the stairs and turning that into an office.
So So you might have a workspace if it's out on the dining room table. That's probably not a good place, just for safety of the records, if nothing else. But you know, policies are important, and I come from the attitude that information security policies and procedures are vital to the success of a business. Not all businesses believe that, but I do. And so if you've got what happens if the home where all of your information gets broken into? What happens if that company computer gets stolen? Employers
Right.
need to have these things thought out. They need to have policies written down and policies in place. I just
And that's why
noticed
they need to call you, right?
that's a good idea.
Yes.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. We've got a little over 10 minutes. I want to give you the platform and the ability to cover things that we haven't been able to cover. For those watching us, we've struggled a little bit with bandwidth ourselves, and so again, with the increase in internet use, I think most people are encountering this kind of issue. Final thoughts, things that maybe we didn't get to cover, we'd hoped to.
No, I think we've covered it fairly well. It's exciting in a sense that we are getting to a point that these services that we can do for training, as well as for business, are becoming virtualized to a point that you're not necessarily going to need in the next year or so the same type of equipment locally. I think about the thin client talk from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
That was always promised. We're finally getting to that point.
Right.
At the same time, it's important not just to think about quarantining yourself from the virus that's out there, but also quarantining your systems properly.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're following those same kind of philosophy and policies, you should be in good shape.
Excellent.
And if you don't know, go talk with Ron.
Thank you again. A good computer hygiene is a wise thing to do, whether you're in the office or not. Other thing might be good communications for remote workers, since I've kind of steered us that way. It wasn't a foregone thought, but since I got us there, maybe something like Zoom is appropriate. Employers and employees are used to being able to talk. I mean, you can walk across the hall or down the hall, and you can have brainstorming sessions on ad hoc, on the fly. Mm-hmm. That isn't possible now. But Zoom meetings can spring up at no time. I also encourage employers to have regular meeting times. Maybe you didn't have them before, but you probably should have, but now they're vital. And allow everyone to ask questions and say what's on their mind. Everyone needs to have buy-in. People working at home, especially if they're alone, maybe their spouse, or maybe they don't have a spouse, maybe they're single. It gets lonesome. And so if their spouse is working outside the home, maybe in one of the essential fields, you need some way to stay in touch. And Zoom is an excellent way to do that. The virtual phone system I mentioned earlier is a way to do that. Collaboration tools. I'm not a fan of Dropbox, but Dropbox Business has made some real strides on security. I'm still not a real fan of them, but I've got other tools that I encourage instead of Dropbox Business. But those kind of things can help keep us in touch. Slack is another alternative that's real popular right now. So what do you think, Matthew?
So we that has been a struggle for us in the past few weeks, just keeping communication going with students, particularly those that don't have maybe more than a cell phone.
Yeah.
Right. So we've employed Google Hangouts. I keep that up and running. Zoom. I keep a Zoom session that's up and going that doesn't have a password set up on it, so that I when I'm not in a meeting or talking like we are now, it's recording someone saying hello. It's like a virtual voicemail, if you will. Uh-huh. But if I'm there, they can knock on my door, be admitted from the waiting room to say, oh, okay, just come on in. Because trying to get that type of scenario moving there, it's interesting how that's developing.
Yeah.
Because you can't just knock on the door down the hallway anymore.
Yeah.
And trying to meet people where they're at is much more difficult now, even having been doing the stuff in a virtual manner for most of my life. it's much more difficult than even I would have expected for what I do. So,
yeah. In the past, I've had, probably half a dozen Zoom meetings a week would be my guess, which seemed like an awful lot to me. But now I have 3 to 4 or 5 a day, and it is entirely different. There's an adjustment factor there. And while I actually welcome the Zoom meetings, every so often I have a day where I don't have any. And like I was saying, it gets kind of lonesome all by yourself.
True.
So it's good, but it's change, and it takes adjustment.
You get to hear everybody's barking dogs and everything else. So it's a little bit more personalized in that sense, right?
There you go. I haven't had any little kids or dogs come behind me, though, so at least I'm doing all right so far.
I've had a few running by. I don't know if you've heard or not, but
not at all. Last 3-4 minutes. Final thoughts, and you'll almost close the program for us.
So I guess what I could say is like that Pythonator 3 class that I've got going this summer. It's free. You can contact me if you want to get in. We still have I think I just expanded out to allow some more faculty in. So if there are people interested, it's a week-long training to get you interested into it. And what I really like about it is that we're finally getting this stuff to a level that you don't have to have 15 degrees to understand how to do machine learning.
Right.
You can come in, maybe you've had a couple of courses, you understand some database work, or you understand a little programming, and you could make sense of how these statistical models work to start doing some data modeling yourself.
Oh, that's amazing. That is fantastic.
I just love how that's just almost there, right?
I was going to ask you, what type of a time commitment in it? I know it's free, but.
Oh yeah. So it's every day for a week. Let me make sure I get the right time frames here. So I have a basic Python course before that. It's like dancing with Pythons is what I call that. Let's see here if I can get the calendar to show up. I'll just go to my cell phone then. Oh, here we go. All right, so June 8th is Python. So this one is June 15th. That entire week. It's on California time, so it's starting at 8 a.m. that time. So I think actually we have it starting at like 8:30. But from 8:30 to 3 each day, except for Friday, it goes till noon. And it's virtual, synchronous, so you can pop in when you want or when you can. And it's recorded, so you can always listen to it later. But it gives that time. That's what we do with a lot of our classes. I've been doing that for most of my life, actually, with classes wherever, even when I was an undergrad, where they would let me get away with it. Yeah. So that I didn't have to wait for 3 hours to find a parking spot.
Right.
So now at least our faculty have been well situated for that. Our faculty for the past 2 years at Lake County in IT have had that available for their students to watch and listen where they need to. So that's the same kind of format for that training. And so the week before, as well as there's a week in July where I've got one coming out of Texas, July 13th on basic Python. And that's when I do, it's not just for IT people, even I have psychology faculty in there. They need to understand how to make this work. At UCLA, to get a psychology degree, you have to have a course in Python now because they do a lot of data analysis. And Python's a pretty easy language to learn. It's based upon Monty Python, so it's a little quirky. Also why I've enjoyed it.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank you. We're just about out of time. I want to thank you for being with us today and struggling through our bandwidth issues that we've had, and all that you're doing. I mean, this is exciting. It's an exciting time for all of us. But there's just so much new, so much happening that whether you're talking about your Pythonator class or it's all that's just going on in the cultural change. I should have asked you, and I didn't. Thoughts on lasting changes this will be in our culture, but maybe we'll save that for the next time.
Sure.
again, thank you. It's a pleasure to see you as always. And folks, thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening to us. Again, WVLP.org is the radio station to stream us on Mondays at 8 a.m., Fridays at 1 p.m. Catch us on demand on any of the podcast channels or podcast platforms. The channel is the Information Playground. The same is true with YouTube. You can watch us there. And I hope you have a great day and stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you.